They were out early one morning, panning in the stream for gold, surrounded by the rising mountains. Old prospector with a tale for two, he brushed around in the pan, and pointing out what lay within was ordinary sand. He began with his story about 20 years before, and a younger man who sought his fortune. With a tear or two he told of searching for his treasure, but making known the gold he sought was ordinary pleasure. There were years of doing without, and there were years of plenty. I started thinking that life was never steady, excepting when the bills came in and I had no money to pay. Whiskey had never tasted better ordinarily. Concluded his story as it filled the air with a laugh, saying how he found the Lord and Savior, and how he found the river of life by which his day unfolds, and pointing out what stands within is not ordinary gold, and pointing out what stands within is not ordinary gold. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. Through His word we can see His wonders, signs and miracles of His love. We can return His love with devotion, standing on His word before all men. We are His beloved and His chosen, walking in this life renewed with peace. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. believe upon his promises. Through his word we can see his wonders, signs and miracles of his love. We can return his love with devotion, standing on his word before all men. We are his beloved and his chosen, walking in this life renewed with peace. Trust in God, believe upon his promises. Trust in God, believe upon his promises. Believe upon his promises.
Well, I'm Mark, and this is Josephine with True North Studio.
Today we ask you to take a little walk with us.
I conned Josephine into tag teaming it with me to try to paint a picture of what it may have been like spending time with the newly resurrected Christ. And I'm going to portray a disciple named Cleopas, and she, Josephine's going to depict his amazing wife named Mary. I also want to show you how important mothers were and are to help this growing thing that we call Christianity. The topic today is the road to Emmaus. Now, my name is Cleopas. If I've told this story once, I've told it 1,000 times. Young Dr. Luke, the traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, was inspired by God to write about the interview Mary and I had with Jesus. It was when Jesus was trying out his brand new, freshly minted, resurrected body.
Those of you who are fortunate enough to have a copy of Luke's notes about Jesus Christ, find the part about our trip to Emmaus. My producer is informing me to tell you it starts in Luke 24:13.
All right, well, Mary and I, like Jesus and all but one apostle, all hail from the Galilee area. We made a little money over the years, so we have a little place, a second home in Emmaus. We wanted a place just a little bit closer to Jerusalem, but not too close. Our other home in Galilee is actually 3 days away.
By the way, there are 3 women in our group, all with the name of Mary. Me, young Mary Magdalene, and Jesus' mother Mary. Mary was a popular name. Everyone in Israel walks to Jerusalem 3 or 4 times a year for the feast. From Galilee, it's a 3-day hike with some camping out involved. We wanted to live a little closer.
I'm not sure if you knew it, but all those years of walking to Jerusalem in huge groups was where Jesus first got to know the boys that became apostles. The kids hung out in packs. They spent days together.
Emmaus is a beautiful little town with spring-fed streams. It's lush and green with huge trees. Plus it has natural hot spring baths. It's only 3.5 miles away, maybe an hour walk from Jerusalem. 8,000 steps each way if you keep track of these things. I do.
Because Emmaus is a strategic spot on the road between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean coast, it was supposed to become a Roman colony soon, which means it will be a tax-free zone.
We like tax-free.
So after the crazy emotional last 3 days, after the death of Jesus, we leave the noise and confusion of Jerusalem behind and are walking back to our quiet little place right off the road in Emmaus. Problem is, my lovely wife Mary was none too happy with me for 3 main reasons. 1, because we left our son, the apostles, and all Mary's lady friends while everyone was grieving over the death of Jesus. 2, because all the apostles, including our son, her son, told the women that they were crazy for saying they had seen angels. And because my Mary and Mary from Magdala said they had actually seen Jesus rise up from the dead.
Oh, by the way, if you know what's good for you, Never call Mary Magdalene crazy.
We'll see who's crazy.
Well, let me finish. 3, Mary was mad at me because I didn't believe her when she told me that she had seen the risen Christ.
I did see Jesus, and I did speak with an angel.
Honestly, I don't actually think I expected Jesus to rise from the dead. But I was expecting him to rise up and rally the people and take over Israel like a king, like David. A lot of us thought that, but now he's gone. Actually, so far, not a single one of us men had actually seen an angel, nor had any of us guys seen the risen Messiah. Only a few of the emotional women said they did.
Then I guess you've got some mansplaining to do, Cleopas, because I know what I saw.
So, like the stubborn fool that I am, I told Mary, enough is enough, we're heading home.
And that's where the fight began.
Mary here didn't want to make a scene, so she hugged our son James and said goodbye to her friends. What made leaving so hard was my wife and I had been traveling with Jesus, our son James, and the other apostles for the better part of a year, off and on. We gave them money, supplies, and food. Other ladies also supported the disciples on this year-long adventure.
But to feed and house Jesus and those 12 young men was spendy. Some of the apostle boys even had families back home to support. That was extra.
Did you know that Mary Magdalene was a poor little rich girl who helped finance and support Jesus and the boys? Joanna and Simone, they also gave a lot of time and money.
Well, while traveling up and down Israel with Jesus and the boys, we saw miracle after miracle. Times were good. Better get on with the story, Cleopas, and tell them why we left Jerusalem and left our son behind.
Jesus had been betrayed by one of the boys, that Judas fellow. We didn't know him all that well. Our teacher had been beat and tortured by the Romans for many, many hours. They did unspeakable things to him. They even crucified him in public, naked, bleeding out, right next to the northwest entrance to Jerusalem. That's where he died. The skies turned black. The wind kicked up. A small earthquake even shook the ground under our feet. It was a surreal day.
Then Joseph from Arimathea and Nicodemus were allowed to remove his body. They cleaned and buried him properly. We thought it was over. What had started off as an exciting year turned deadly. We were all afraid.
So, we said our goodbyes to the boys, left the rented room our son was staying at with the other apostles, wound our way through the noisy, dusty, crowded streets of Jerusalem, and walked into the setting sun.
Jerusalem was built on a hill, so the afternoon view heading west was breathtaking. It always was.
We started walking down the Roman-built cobblestone road, heading downhill to our beautiful Emmaus. The trees were already in full leaf. The road dropped softly into the valley like a song. The sun was in our eyes.
Once we were 100 yards away from Jerusalem and had managed to separate ourselves from other travelers leaving the city, I let Cleopas have it.
Well, and I was angry that Mary had embarrassed me and our son back there in front of the apostles.
I was none too happy with you either, Buster, because you didn't believe I saw the risen Christ.
Hey, we were having one of those low voice, act like you're not having a fight type of fights.
No sooner had we started arguing, a foreigner in weird clothes walked up behind us and started listening to us. Have you ever had a stranger just walk up behind you?
Out of nowhere, this guy was literally walking in step with us. He basically just decided he was going to join us. He made himself part of our group.
How you doing?
What am I telling you?
Travelers are lonely. We didn't mind. He was a welcome distraction. Plus, he had a cool hat.
This guy seemed to listen to us for a few minutes, smiling, looking at each of us as we argued as privately as we could. And then he started asking us questions. Don't you love it when someone you don't even know joins into your conversation? We had no clue who this guy was. Those of you who live in a city can usually pick out the tourist. This guy looked like an out-of-towner. He dressed like one and talked with the unmistakable, slow, sun-bleached accent of someone from way down south on the north coast of Africa.
We didn't realize it at the time, but this visitor had actually been listening to us for a minute. Then he started to redirect our conversation. We didn't mind. It was a nice break to distract us from the crazy week and from our little argument. Plus, the young man looked nice enough, was about our son's age, and seemed very interested in our conversation slash argument.
Here's how I remember it. The traveler dude said, "Your conversation seems a bit heated and unhappy, brah. Plus, you look a little sad and angry at the same time. Mind if I ask why?" We stop walking and just stand there, mouths open in disbelief, looking at the eavesdropper. And I think, who the heck is this guy? I look him in the eye and I say, how is it even possible? You've been in Jerusalem the last few days. How can you be the only visitor in Jerusalem who hadn't heard about what's happened? Then the traveler said, "What happened? What are you talking about?" And
we've been talking about a man, a friend named Jesus from Nazareth. He was a mighty prophet. He did amazing miracles and preached a powerful message to anyone who would listen. Our chief priests and authorities hated him, were jealous of him, and tricked the Romans into executing him, crucifying him. They just nailed him to a post like a common criminal on a busy road between four bad guys.
We've been hoping that Jesus was the one, the one who would liberate all Israel from Rome. We thought that the movement was happening, was really beginning to take shape. And then our teacher, our rabbi, our son's friend Jesus was killed.
It all happened so fast. Anyway, that was 3 days ago.
Then earlier today, some of the women in our group, including my Mary here, really shocked us. They went to Jerusalem, to Jesus' tomb early this morning, but came back and said they didn't see his body anywhere, said it was gone. The women told everyone in the room what they saw. We were horrified, shocked, and confused. Why would someone steal his body?
That's just part of the story. Here's how it really happened. 3 days earlier, my girlfriends and I, Mary Magdalene, Simone, Joanna, and a couple of others had seen Jesus buried improperly. We saw Joseph of Arimathea just wrap Jesus in a clean sheet and place him in a brand new tomb.
Just so you know, Mr. Traveler, sir, the girls weren't aware that another friend of Jesus's, a man named Nicodemus, came back and helped bury Jesus in the traditional manner. They wrapped him up sort of like a mummy and covered him with maybe 75 pounds of sweet smelling paste to cut the smell of death.
Whatever. We didn't know Nicodemus was off buying the spices and grave wrappings, so we bought them. We plan on going back to the grave after the weekly Sabbath to bury Jesus right. So early that morning, we gathered the spices and wrappings and went back to the grave. We had no idea how we were going to have access to the grave because of the Roman guards. We also didn't know how we were going to roll the heavy stone off the opening. We would deal with both of those issues when we got there. Things always seemed to work out. As we got close, a shock went up our spines. We noticed that someone had already moved the huge stone that covered the tomb door, and that the guards were gone. Something was wrong. We stooped down and looked inside the tomb, and there was a young man just sitting there. It struck us as a bit weird for some handsome stranger to be sitting in an empty tomb. Actually, it scared the you-know-what out of us. It turns out the guy was an angel. He just told us Jesus wasn't there, that he had risen. It was a little bit freaky, if you know what I mean. So we hustled back to tell our son, my husband, and the other apostles in the B&B.
Come on, Mary. Stop filling this guy's head with your silly stories. Then the traveler said, "I don't mind. It's a pretty great story."
When I said that, the angel told us Jesus was alive. The traveler just smiled with his warm coastal grin. I said, "Sir, no one believed us. Not our son James, not the apostles, not my husband, not anyone." Frustrating.
Hold on a second, Mary. Didn't one of Jesus' apostles, Peter, and another young man run to the sepulchre for a look-see after you told us your tall tale? You know, if I remember right, all Peter said he saw was the hollow tube of grave clothes, and they looked like an empty cocoon in the shape of a human body. But there was no Jesus, no body, and certainly no angel. Peter told us that he thought the Romans had pulled the body out of the grave shell and hid it. So Peter also said that the young man who ran there with him seemed to actually believe that Jesus rose through the grave wrappings. That got me scratching my head. It just didn't make any sense.
Peter and the kid went back to the house and told everyone that the body was gone, but the grave wrappings were just lying there in the hollow shape of a man, but empty. My son and the boys were super confused. All us ladies just looked at each other. We knew.
Hey, we found out later that young Mary Magdalene had left the room and followed Peter back to the grave, but stood back a bit, just watching.
Look, when Mary took off, I followed her. Mary got there before I did. That girl was a crazy fast walker. I think she really went back for another look because she had to make sure she actually saw an angel. Now, here's where the story really gets good. Moments before I got to the grave, Mary Magdalene was already there. In tears, she stooped down and peeked in. But this time she saw two good-looking men, one at the head and one at the feet of the hollow grave clothes.
See, these two young men ask her why she's crying.
Young Mary Magdalene didn't yet believe that Christ rose from the dead. So she told the two young men she needed to know where they've taken the body. Have I told you Mary is pretty bold?
This time Mary didn't even think they were angels. Again, it's weird that Mary actually had a conversation with two men sitting in a tomb and calmly talking to her. But hey, she's Mary Magdalene. What are you going to do?
I hadn't yet made it to the grave. I was almost there. I wondered again, what happened to the Roman guards? Could we be arrested? Was it a trap? We were sort of scared. There had already been so much death in Jerusalem lately.
Young Mary Magdalene told us she had that feeling you get when you feel someone standing silently behind you in your comfort zone. Young Mary whips around, still bawling her eyes out, and she sees this man standing there dressed like a gardener, like the caretaker of the cemetery.
The gardener also asked her why she was crying and what she was looking for.
For some reason, our traveler friend right then broke into a radiant smile, when we brought up the gardener and Mary. Seemed sort of strange to me at the time.
Young Mary then asked the gardener where he moved the body. He didn't answer.
Now I'm jumping ahead a bit. But if this gardener guy really was Jesus, I'm not sure how he would have been able to keep a straight face. He had to be coming out of his skin. This would have been Jesus' best acting job ever. I'm just saying.
Don't get ahead of the story, Cleopas. You always do that. Well, Mary Magdalene turned back to the tomb crying like crazy until the gardener guy behind her said her name in a special way, in that rich voice of our friend Jesus.
Mary, it's me!
She recognized his voice, turned around, and poof, right before her eyes, the gardener turned into the beautiful and strong pre-crucifixion looking Jesus. I just got to say, Jesus was one good-looking boy.
That's the instant Mary Magdalene said she realized it was Jesus. This would have been his second form change, but I didn't believe a word of it. Crazy story, crazy ladies. If it was only true, that would have been quite a moment. It would mean that, if it was true, young Mary from Magdala would have been the first person on earth to see the risen Christ. I don't think so. I think the girls are just emotional wrecks.
Cleopas, Mary didn't just say she saw Jesus. Mary saw Jesus.
I don't believe it.
By the time I finally caught up with young Mary Magdalene, she told me she just had seen Jesus. I was crazy blessed. We had to go tell the men. Then as I was walking with Mary back to the house, all of a sudden, walking towards us was Jesus with a huge smile on his face. We both grabbed him like there was no tomorrow, and then he just vanished.
Hey, Jesus was a joker at times. He liked to have fun. Like the time he walked on the water through the storm, and when he wave walked his way to the boat, he acted, like he was just on a stroll and started to walk past the boys and past the boat, and they just flipped out.
Let me tell you my own story, Cleopas. Plus, you're getting off the track. Well, Jesus was with us for a minute. He smiled a knowing grin, and then he just disappeared, vanished. Mary and I looked at each other like, what just happened? It was him. Jesus actually rose from the dead, just like he said he would. We went back to the room where all our stubborn men were gathered. But this time we had radiant smiles on our faces. We were animated. We were blessed beyond belief. We told the sad-faced men in no uncertain terms that at this time we didn't just see an angel, but we actually saw our teacher, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, in the flesh. True to form, the apostles and the other men, including my husband Cleopas here, still didn't believe us. Their unbelief was unbelievable. What's it going to take for our big, strong men to believe Jesus actually rose from the dead?
Hold on, Mary. You're filling this traveler's head with your foolishness. Haven't we all been through enough these past few days? Sir, this rising from the dead thing is what we've been bickering about since we left Jerusalem. It just doesn't make any sense. And that was a moment that the traveler smiled and took control of the conversation. The sun was almost down now. The crowd was thinning. The air was beginning to cool off, but our hearts were about to heat up. The traveler said, "Come on, you two. Why are you being so five senses? Why are your hearts so sluggish when it comes to believing what the prophets have been saying all along? Didn't they all say this had to happen this way? Didn't the anointed one, the Christ, the Messiah, have to experience all kinds of sufferings before he could finish his work, rise from the dead, and come into his glory? Look, if you two are heading to Emmaus, and since we're talking about the Christ, I have just enough time to share with you every single scripture concerning the Messiah, starting with Moses and then working through all the prophets. Does that sound good?" And then he said, "I have put to memory every single verse that even mentions the Messiah. An hour or so should do it."
Then our new friend broke into quoting and explaining every single verse where the prophets mentioned the Messiah. Most we've heard, some we hadn't.
But as he was talking, something began to change in me. Sorrow turned to hope. Lights were turning on inside of me. Who is this guy? Our walk back home seemed like a minute.
Just as our new friend finished reciting the passages concerning the Christ, we got to our lovely village of Emmaus. God, I love this place. This guy blew us away. Now, instead of arguing or weeping or grieving, we were on fire.
I think that Mary and I have made a new friend. We didn't want him to stop sharing the word, so we invited him over for dinner. But instead of accepting our invitation and coming into our home, he said he was just going to keep heading west toward the coast.
As our custom was, we basically begged this guy to stay over because it was supper time and because the sun was almost down. A spring chill was in the air. He had to be hungry. Plus, he probably needed a place to stay. It blows my mind, but it was still Sunday. So much had happened today. Where do I start? Well, our amazing new friend finally came in and sat with Cleopas as I prepared some food.
Mary always had a little bit of food partially prepared when we left in the morning. So our new friend sat down with me and talked and waited on dinner. I snacked on some olives and figs. And then when Mary served us the bread and wine, something happened that rang a bell in our hearts. The traveler did something that the apostles had been talking about since the Last Supper that they had had with Jesus.
They called it the memorial or something like that. Only a few of us knew about it.
The memorial is when Jesus said at his Last Supper with the apostle boys that the bread would represent his broken body and the wine will represent his blood that was shed for our forgiveness of sins, something like that. He told them that every time we eat or drink, we should remember what he went through for us. Guess that's why they call it a memorial.
What happened next pretty much stunned us. This traveler, our new friend, didn't wait for me to serve him. He served us in our home. Now he was acting more like a rabbi than he was a tourist.
He took one small, warm, round loaf of Mary's bread and he set it out and he picked it up and he blessed it. And then he broke it into a couple of pieces and handed them to us. This breaking of bread ceremony is what some people now call communion, or as Mary likes to call it, the love feast.
I call it the Feast of Love because those of us who love the risen Christ remind each other of what he accomplished every single time we eat together. Plus, Jesus' intense younger brother Jude called it the Feast of Charity.
The second our new friend handed us the bread, the traveler instantly changed into Jesus. The Jesus we had followed for a year. How on earth? What the?
Cleopas and I, we looked at each other. What just happened? Can you imagine? We both recognized him. Jesus then gave us an ear-to-ear grin, and then he just flat out vanished. Poof, he was gone.
I was like, what? Mary was like, what? One thing for sure, I finally believe Jesus is alive. I finally believe the Christ actually did rise from the dead. I finally believe my wife.
Told you so.
Yes, dear, you did. We realized that we had just spent maybe 2 hours hanging out with the newly risen Christ. Unbelievable. I just realized that I'm the first man to see the risen Christ, but I still didn't understand why he spent all this time with us, with Mary and me. There had to be a reason.
Cleopas, my heart felt like it was on fire when we were walking with him down the road, and when he was sharing those scriptures. Talk about hot flashes. Hello.
Mary, those scriptures he quoted one after the other for almost an hour ignited something in me like I'd never experienced before. I can't believe he's really up. So sorry I doubted you, Mary, when you told me you'd seen him earlier. You've seen him twice today now, right? Wow.
I sure did, Cleo. We better hurry back to Jerusalem because Peter and the boys need to hear that Jesus did rise from the dead. Our son James needs to hear this from his dad. He's not listening to me. James isn't going to believe this, but I hope he does.
Well, we were so excited, so pumped, it didn't take us an hour to get back to Jerusalem, to the house in Jerusalem, where the boys were staying. We basically flew. We were there in a flash, but not as fast as Jesus. The air was crisp and dark when we got back to the house in Jerusalem where our son and the apostles were staying, but something was different. The guys were acting strange and animated.
All the girls were still there, but only 11 of the 12 apostles were present. Young Thomas had gone outside for a breath of fresh air.
Hey, I needed a moment.
This meant that Judas, the rat, was there when we came back. Judas was acting even weirder than usual. I had my suspicions about that boy.
It's hard to imagine how Judas felt after betraying the Christ and then just sitting with the apostles like nothing happened. I don't get it.
Before we could tell the boys what had happened back to us back in Emmaus, a few of the apostles told us that Jesus had appeared to Peter. Most of the men still didn't look convinced. We noticed that they were skeptical of even Peter.
It seemed that only the women were really sure of what we saw. Talking to those boys was like talking to a wall.
Mary and I looked at each other with that knowing glance of married people. We realized that the moment Jesus vanished from our home in Emmaus, somehow he made it to Jerusalem in record time. He found Peter and talked to him. This all happened in the hour it took us to race back to Jerusalem.
The moment Jesus disappeared from our dining area, Jesus somehow instantly appeared in Jerusalem and met with Peter alone.
As amazing as it was to realize that Jesus rose from the dead, we now realize the reason Jesus spent so much time with us was because we were supposed to do an intervention with the stubborn apostles and with our son.
This whole happened to us as a mom and dad could help the boys believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Except for my husband, the women, and maybe Peter, that the other young guy who was with him earlier Not a single one of the apostles believed Jesus rose from the dead. Not even our son.
Now we realize that it was our job, me and Mary, the parents of James, to get these apostles to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's why Jesus appeared to us in Emmaus.
How do you convince people you know really well that Jesus rose from the dead? Most of the apostles still didn't believe, but all us women do.
We also know that there have never been a day of Pentecost. Never have been a pouring out of the gift of Holy Spirit. Never have even been Christianity without these apostles, including our son James, believing that Jesus rose from the dead. Now I jumped ahead of myself again.
Our son James and the other apostles finally gave us the floor to talk. After all, they loved us. I was like mom to all of them. That gave us an element of respect.
After the apostles stopped yapping about if Peter really saw Jesus or not, Mary and I finally had our chance to share what had happened on that walk to Emmaus with the resurrected Christ.
As we went through a shortened version of what happened to us on the road to Emmaus, from the looks of almost all their faces, most of the apostles still didn't believe us. Nor did they believe Jesus was risen. But I could tell some were warming up to the idea.
Then Mary and I broke into telling them some of the verses our traveler friend shared and how he did that Last Supper breaking of bread thing, just like the apostles had talked about.
The women were all smiling like crazy, but the boys were looking back and forth at each other, not sure if they should believe us or not.
Then it happened. Just as we were telling the story about the traveler in our home, picking up a piece of Mary's bread and saying that it represented his body, poof!
Jesus himself in all his glory appeared smack dab in the middle of the room, and at the exact same time in conversation where he had disappeared from our house.
At the exact same moment he vanished from our conversation, he picked our story back up. Talk about theatrical timing. The boys were freaking out. They thought Jesus was some sort of devil spirit. Imagine? But in their defense, let me tell you, Jesus was a sight. This time he showed himself with holes all the way through his hands and feet, where the Roman spikes had nailed him to the bloody post. He walked around that room and asked each of the boys to actually touch his wounds.
Then, to break the really weird mode, Jesus asked for something to eat. That food trick always works with guys.
Do you think the bread and the wine representing the broken body and shed blood of the resurrected Christ representing health and forgiveness are important? I would say so.
We now know that the reason the newly risen Christ spent so much time with us was because he needed us, a mother and a father, to help him convince his stubborn apostles, our son's friends, that he actually rose from the dead.
The apostles trusted me. Jesus trusted me. I was James's dad. I supported them all financially. I knew most of them since they were boys. Mary traveled with them for weeks this past year. She was like a mom to them. We were disciples like so many of them. Our son was one of the apostles.
Maybe Jesus knew that a mother and father figure would help begin to convince these stubborn young men to believe he did, in fact, rise from the dead. All us girls already believed.
Time was of the essence. We now know that Jesus had maybe 40 more days to convince all the apostles that he did, in fact, rise from the dead.
Jesus needed us. He knew that because Cleo and I were the parents of James, that the boys would listen to us.
Looking back, I was so darn stubborn, so closed off, so blind. It took the resurrected Christ, disguised like an out-of-towner, sharing the word with us, to wake me up so I could awaken others to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. It took Mother here to help me believe.
Cleopas, I guess in some small way, I did help.
You sure did. That day, we were able to help a few of the apostles begin to get over their believing hurdle, help them warm up to the idea that Christ really did rise from the dead.
It would take about almost 40 days and a total of 11 appearances for all the apostles to believe that Jesus really, truly rose from the dead. But that's another story for another time.
When Jesus appeared to the apostles behind closed doors, most of the apostles still thought that he was that what the women saw was some sort of vision or an angel, or it was some fancy trick set up by spirits. These men had seen a lot of crazy things over the years. Remember the time when Jesus walked on the water? That time they all thought that Jesus was a devil spirit.
Some of the apostles, and hopefully our son, are finally ready to hear that Jesus was raised from the dead some 3 days after he was buried. He appeared 5 times his first day up.
It's crazy to think that the first person Jesus appeared to in his resurrected body was the young, beautiful, faithful, and supportive and totally sane Mary Magdalene. He changed from gardener to regular Jesus for her.
His second appearance happened just moments after he showed himself to young Mary. He appeared to me and Mary. We both held on to him like there was no tomorrow. That time he appeared walking towards us, smiling.
Third, the resurrected Christ walked, talked, and laughed, sat down to eat with me and Mary on the road to Emmaus, or in our house on Emmaus. And it was the second time Mary saw him, but it was the first time for me. This time he looked like someone from way out of town.
Fourth, while we were speed walking back to Emmaus to tell the boys in Jerusalem what we saw, Jesus got back to Jerusalem in record time and appeared to Peter alone.
And the fifth and final time Jesus appeared in his resurrected body the first day up was when Mary here and I were sharing with the apostles what happened in Emmaus. He just appeared in the room and took over the conversation. Poof.
This time Jesus looked like he had holes in his hands and feet. Plus he ate with us. What a crazy first day up. Jesus actually rose from the dead. Wow.
Mary and I played our part his first day up to help Peter and the other apostles and our son begin to believe that he rose from the dead. Mary was like a mother to those boys.
It's weird, but even after seeing Jesus appear in the room for his 5th appearance that day, still didn't convince some of the apostles. I guess believing that someone rose from the dead can be a stretch. Believing that was hard for you too, Cleopas.
Hey, it was. I guess so. Dr. Luke once reminded us that Jesus said, if people don't respond to what the prophets said about the Messiah, they won't even be persuaded if they actually saw him rise from the dead.
Didn't young John the Apostle, Peter's fishing buddy, also remind us that Jesus said, "Blessed are they who have not seen and still believe"? How would you like to meet the resurrected Jesus? How would you like to spend a few minutes with him? Believe it or not, you probably already have met him, and you didn't even know it, didn't even recognize him. Didn't that young disciple named Matthew write, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them"?
He sure did. Come here.
Hi there.
He sure did. Believe it or not, you've all probably met him and didn't even realize it. After appearing 5 more times that very first day, Jesus appeared at least 6 more times over the next 40 days leading up to his big reveal on Pentecost.
That was one crazy special Pentecost celebration. That was where every single person who believed that Jesus rose from the dead began to speak in.
Hold on, Mary. Now you're jumping way ahead. Let's save that story for another time.
Okay, but it's such a good story. Well, it took 40 more days before every single one of the young apostle boys believed that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the dead. In some small way, Cleopas and I helped. We were just a simple mom and dad.
We now know that the only way to receive Holy Spirit, the only way to get born again, is to believe deep in your heart that God raised Jesus, our teacher, the long-awaited Messiah, from the dead.
In fact, now we know that the day of Pentecost that I started to tell you all about only happened because all the apostles believed that Jesus Christ, our friend and teacher, was raised from the dead. They all had to believe.
The big lesson of the day is for each of us, for you and I, to believe that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the dead and he is still around. He's probably still disguising himself and still helping us. The reason Jesus spent so much time with us his first day up was because he knew that Mary and I, who would become like a mom and a dad to the apostles were the ones who would help the boys begin to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. For this day to have been such a success, it took a mother like Mary here pushing like crazy to get us to believe. And of course, thank you all for joining us as we walked and as Jesus walked with us all on that road to Emmaus.
So let's say it one more time.
He is risen.
Wahoo! And by the way, to all you moms out there,
Happy Mother's Day. God bless you all.